So far, we've seen how to create indirect illumination with mental ray in 3ds Max 2010 using global illumination and photon mapping. But there is a second indirect illumination algorithm we can use, and you can use it by itself. You can also combine it with global illumination. We'll see that later. And this algorithm that I'm talking about is called Final Gather. Okay, it's a very powerful lighting feature. It can be pretty fast if you set it up right, and it can create some very nice indirect illumination in your scenes. So let's have a look and see how to get started with that. So let's open up an example scene here, and the scene we're looking for is called 04 Scene FG Start. So let's open that one up, and this is what we have. Very simple model here in our scene, and let's just go ahead and do a quick test render here. And I'm using mental ray. If for whatever reason you're not, go ahead and switch to it. And here's the basic default render default settings. Now by default, Final Gather is turned on every time we use mental ray. That's just the way that 3ds Max 2010 works. And as you've seen before, we can control the Final Gather down here where it says Final Gather Precision and the little UI here in the render frame window. Right now it's set to custom. Let's go ahead and let's turn it off completely. So let's disable Final Gather. And let's render again. Okay, so it looks virtually the same, except that it rendered just a little bit faster. Now, here's the thing about Final Gather. Final Gather can be used with lights and even without lights. That is to say, we can light up this entire scene here using Final Gather without using a single 3ds Max or even a mental ray light. How can that be? Well, it's just the way that Final Gathering works. Let me show you how that works. Let me close this. Let's go to the rendering menu, and let's go to environment. Shortcut is 8 on the keyboard. Okay. Now, if you remember earlier in this tutorial, we saw a video where we talked about the global lighting here in 3ds Max, and by default, a new scene will have a global lighting with a tint color of white and a level of 1. That's what's creating the light in our scene. If I go ahead and render this out, the reason why we can see this blue object here is because there's this default global lighting going on inside of 3ds Max. Now, when you're using Final Gathering, you don't need to have any type of global lighting. We can actually turn it off. So let's turn it off by changing it to 0. You can also turn it off by taking the tint and switching it to black. That'll turn it off as well. So let's just knock it down to 0, and let's close that. Now you notice that in our viewport, the object turned black because we don't have any global lighting. To make things easier for us to see in our viewport so we don't see just this silhouette, let's go ahead and click on Smooth Highlights up here in the viewport and switch our view option here from Smooth Highlights to Hidden Line. That way we can actually see the model in the viewport. And now let's render again. And what we're going to get is a pitch black scene because there's no global lighting. There's no lighting at all. Okay, so to be able to see this, we can actually use Final Gather. So if we turn on Final Gather, let's turn it on to draft mode and render again. You notice that we still can't see anything. Well, that's because Final Gather needs some kind of an object to be able to create some of these Final Gather rays. Or at least I should say to create some visible Final Gather rays. And how do we do that? We can actually do that with a material. The material of an object can actually control the lighting in the scene when we're using Final Gather. So let's see how we could do that. What we're going to do is create an environment, basically a big dome around our scene here. And it doesn't have to be a dome, but I'm going to go ahead and choose a dome shape. So let's go to the create menu. Let's go to standard primitives, and we're going to create a sphere. And we'll just drag here from the center out. Doesn't have to be exact. Right click to end the creation of the sphere there. Let's go ahead and use the scale tool here and scale this up really, really big. Very big. Okay, so it takes up the entire scene. Let's right click on the sphere, and in the quad menu, go to the transform quad menu here and go to convert to, and let's convert this to an editable poly. Okay, once we do that, we can actually go here and select the polygons, and you can do that quickly by hitting 4 on the keyboard by default. Then hit Control and A to select all the polygons of the model. And what we want to do is right click to open up the quad menu, and in the lower left quad menu, go to the last option here. It says flip normals. What that does, it takes all the polygons and flips them inside out. It doesn't look like anything happened, but that's exactly what happened. Okay, so let's just go to object select mode. You can just click on the polygon icon here in the modify panel again to go to the object select mode here. And now with this object selected, what we can do is hit a render, and we still won't get anything. Well, that's because we have to give a material to this object, so we're still not done here. So to do that, let's go ahead and open up the material editor. We can do that quickly by hitting M on the keyboard. And here's the material editor. The first material up here on the upper left slot, which is called 01 default, let's just leave it as a blend shader. What we're going to do is we're going to activate self-illumination right here. So we're going to turn on self-illumination, and we can use this color to control the color of the material on the dome sphere. That's the environment of the scene basically. Okay, so let's take this color and let's increase it to white. And let's hit OK. And let's close the material editor. And now let's do another render and see what happens. And what happens is we get a pitch black render. The reason that happens is because I usually forget to do little itty bitty things like this. Let's go back to the material editor using M on the keyboard. And of course, after you create the material, you have to apply it to the actual sphere. So just left click, drag and drop it on top of the sphere. And once you do that, now the sphere will have the white material. Oops. Okay, so now let's do a render. There we go. So now we can see something. So we don't have any global lighting in this scene. And we don't have any standard lights in this scene either. So why is the scene being lit up here? What is controlling the lighting? Well, it's the bright material from the object in the scene. And because if we go back to the material editor, M on the keyboard to do that, when we have self-illumination turned on, that means that the material can basically self-illuminate itself. And when you're using final gathering, self-illuminating materials can actually illuminate objects in the scene. So you can actually use this to create, say, a light bulb, a fluorescent light tube, maybe a neon light. If you ever seen those signs, like a neon sign that says open or closed or something like that on a storefront, you can actually create that using final gathering. And you can model out the neon sign and then apply self-illuminated material to it, render with final gather, and boom, there you go. Alright, so if we render this out, we can see that we get some pretty nice lighting here. It's all being created by indirect illumination via final gather. And the reason we turn off the global lighting is because if we have the global lighting on, it's going to affect the lighting. And let me show you. Let me go ahead and clone this image out so we can compare to it in a moment. Alright, let's go ahead and hit 8 on the keyboard to open up the environment effects window. And let's take the global lighting and put it back to a setting of 1. So we'll change the level to 1, which is the default, what we had before. So let me go ahead and render this out again. And there we go. You can see the clear difference here between having no global lighting on the left and turning on the default global lighting on the right. On the right, the lighting is pretty much destroyed because we have that global lighting in our scene, so the final gathering doesn't look that good and actually brightens up the scene more. So it doesn't look that nice. It's better when you're using final gathering without any of that global lighting, as it looks much better and we can isolate the final gather effect by itself without having it be basically affected here by this global lighting, which doesn't look too good. So that's why you want to turn the global lighting off. Okay, so let me go back and do that. Let me turn it back off. Set it to 0. That turns it off. And there we go. Keep in mind that we can also come back here to the environment effects window and we can control the lighting in our scene. If we weren't using this sphere, this dome around our scene, we can actually control the lighting using the color of the background. We can also plug in an environment map, and it's always helpful to use high dynamic range images for the environment map. You can use OpenEXR images. You can also use HDR images. So if you have any of those, or if you buy any of them off the internet, or if you create any of them yourself, you can actually plug them in here and get yourself some very nice lighting. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. Now you know how to use, how to activate Final Gather, how to use a self-illuminating material in 3ds Max to light up a scene using Final Gather. I'm going to end this video here, and in the next one we're going to start to actually dig deep into Final Gather and find out what makes it tick.